I need you to stay with me for a moment, because what I'm about to say might not feel good at first. But I promise you, it's going to set somebody free today. We live in a culture that treats brokenness like it's a bad word. Like if you're falling apart, you must have done something wrong. Like if you're in pieces, God must have turned his back on you. But what if I told you that the very thing you've been crying about, the very season that brought you to your knees, what if that wasn't God abandoning you? What if that was God choosing you? See, we want a God who keeps everything comfortable, who keeps everything together, who never lets the storm touch us. But comfort doesn't always build character. Sometimes the breaking is the blessing. Sometimes the dismantling is the miracle in disguise. I've learned something in my own life. And honey, I had to learn it the hard way. That God doesn't break what he doesn't intend to rebuild. He's not wasteful. He's not cruel. He's a craftsman. And every craftsman knows that sometimes you have to tear down the old structure before you can build something that was actually meant to last. So today, I need you to shift your perspective. Stop asking God, why are you breaking me? And start asking him, what are you building? Because the answer will change everything. We have to talk about something that nobody really wants to sit in, but everybody needs to hear. We have been taught somewhere along the way that if life is going hard on you, if things are falling apart around you, if you are waking up in the middle of the night with tears on your pillow and questions in your chest that you can't even find the words for, we have been taught that all of that means something went wrong, that you missed a step, that you said the wrong prayer or made the wrong choice, or that somehow, some way, you ended up outside of the will of God. But I need you to challenge that narrative today, because that belief has kept too many people stuck in shame when they should have been standing in surrender. Brokenness is not a sign that God is finished with you. Brokenness is a sign that God is not done yet. There is a profound difference between a punishment and a process, and until you learn to tell the two apart, you will keep misreading the seasons of your life. Punishment is what happens when something is over, but a process is what happens when something is just getting started. And what looks like God turning away from you is very often God leaning in closer than he has ever been, working on the parts of you that only he can reach. Think about how a seed works. You plant it in the ground, and before anything beautiful happens, before anything breaks through the surface and reaches toward the light, that seed has to crack open. It has to split. It has to lose the very shell that once protected it. And if you didn't understand the process, if you dug it up too early and looked at it, you would think something had gone terribly wrong. You would think the seed was ruined. But the gardener knows that the cracking is not the end of the seed. It is the beginning of everything the seed was always meant to become. You are that seed, and God is not a careless gardener. I think about the moments in my own life when I felt the most broken, when everything I had built my identity around had crumbled, when the version of myself that I had been presenting to the world was no longer sustainable. And I remember thinking that God had somehow miscalculated. I remember feeling like I was too far gone, like the damage was too deep, like whatever plan God had for my life, surely it couldn't include this level of pain. But what I know now that I didn't know then is that God was not miscalculating. He was being precise. He was surgical. He was removing things from my life that looked like blessings on the outside, but were actually limitations. He was stripping away layers that I had built for protection that had actually become prisons. And he loved me too much to let me stay comfortable in a cage just because the cage was familiar. We have to stop equating comfort with favor. Just because something feels good doesn't mean it's growing you. And just because something hurts doesn't mean it's harming you. Some of the greatest growth that has ever happened in your life came wrapped in something that felt unbearable at the time. And some of the things you thought were blessings were actually holding you back from the fullness of what God had prepared for you. Brokenness has a way of clearing out the clutter. It has a way of showing you what was real and what was just an illusion. It has a way of introducing you to a version of yourself that you never would have met if everything had stayed comfortable and intact. There is something about being broken that strips you of pretense. When you are in pieces, you don't have the energy to perform anymore. You don't have the capacity to keep up the image. And as painful as that is, as exposing as that feels, that is actually one of the most holy moments a person can experience. Because it is in that rawness, in that vulnerability, in that absolute inability to hold yourself together, that God finally has access to the real you. Not the you that shows up on Sunday morning with everything pulled together. Not the you that posts the highlight reel, the real you, the unfiltered, unpolished, unguarded you. And that is the version of you that God has always been trying to reach. The enemy wants you to believe that your brokenness disqualifies you. He wants you to look at your cracks and your fractures and your wounds and conclude that you are damaged beyond use. But God looks at those same cracks and sees entry points. He sees places where his light can get in. He sees evidence of a life that has been lived, a faith that has been tested, a person who is being made ready for something that requires exactly the kind of depth that only comes through breaking. You cannot pour into others from a shallow place. You cannot lead people through valleys you have never walked through. You cannot speak with authority about restoration if you have never needed to be restored. Brokenness, when you let God into it, becomes your greatest credential. It becomes the thing that makes you relatable. It becomes the thing that makes your story matter not just to you, but to every single person who hears it and recognizes themselves in it. Somebody needs to see that you survived your breaking. Somebody needs to know that the pieces can be put back together. Somebody is waiting on the other side of your healing to find out that there is hope for them too. And that somebody will never get what they need if you spend the rest of your life being ashamed of the very thing that God is trying to use. I want you to sit with something for a moment, because this right here might be the very word that somebody in this room has been waiting to hear. I want you to hear it not just in your mind, but deep down in the places that have been hurting, in the places that have been questioning, in the places that have been wondering whether what you're going through has any purpose at all. And the word is this: God does not break what he does not intend to restore. I need you to let that land. I need you to let that settle into the soil of your spirit, because if you truly grab hold of this truth, it will reframe every painful season you have ever walked through and every difficult chapter that may still be ahead of you. We serve a God who is intentional. He does not do anything by accident. He does not allow things into your life carelessly or without purpose. Every single thing that has touched your life has first passed through his hands, and if he allowed it, then he already had a plan for what comes after it. That is not a cliche. That is not something you put on a coffee mug and forget about. That is a theological reality that should shift the way you interpret your pain. God is not reckless with his children. He is not up in heaven watching your life unravel and shrugging his shoulders. He is present, he is attentive, and he is working. Even in the moments when you cannot feel him working, even in the seasons when the silence feels louder than any word he has ever spoken to you. Think about a potter and clay. It is one of the oldest images in all of Scripture, and I think we have heard it so many times that we have stopped really seeing it. A potter takes a lump of clay, and before that clay becomes anything beautiful, before it takes any shape worth admiring, it goes through pressure. It goes through the hands of someone who is pressing into it, reshaping it, sometimes collapsing it entirely to start over, not because the clay is worthless, but because the potter has a vision for it that the clay cannot yet see. The potter does not destroy the clay. The potter works the clay. And there is a profound difference between destruction and transformation. even when they feel identical from the inside of the process. What feels like being crushed is actually being shaped. What feels like being torn apart is actually being made ready. I think about Joseph in the pit. I think about him sitting in that dark, cold, lonely place, surrounded by the evidence of his brother's betrayal, wondering where God was in all of it. And if we are honest, most of us would have concluded in that pit that God had forgotten us. Most of us would have looked at those circumstances and decided that the dream was dead, that the promise was a lie, that whatever we thought God had spoken over our lives was clearly not going to come to pass. But Joseph's story teaches us something critical. The pit was not the end of the promise. The pit was part of the path. The breaking that Joseph experienced in that moment was not God abandoning him. It was God positioning him. And everything that Joseph went through, every betrayal, every false accusation, every year in prison was not wasted. It was working. It was building something in Joseph that a comfortable life never could have produced. You have to understand that God is not interested in just giving you a good life. He is interested in making you into a person who can carry the weight of the life He has called you to. And sometimes the person you need to become requires the dismantling of the person you currently are. That is not cruelty. That is love in its most purposeful form. A good father does not just give his child everything they want. A good father disciplines, challenges, stretches, and sometimes allows difficulty because he can see further down the road than the child can. And God, as our Father, can see the fullness of what He created you for, and He is unwilling to let you settle for a smaller version of that just because the process of becoming is uncomfortable. There is something else I need you to understand, and it is this: the fact that God intends to restore you means that He sees value in you worth restoring. You do not restore something you consider worthless. You do not invest the time and the care and the precision of restoration into something you plan to throw away. When an artist restores a painting, it is because they recognize that beneath the damage, beneath the wear and the tear and the years of neglect, there is something of extraordinary value. And God, who is the ultimate artist, who knit you together with His own hands and called you His masterpiece, looks at you in your most broken state and sees not a lost cause, but a restoration project worth every ounce of His attention. I know it doesn't feel that way when you're in it. I know when you are lying on the floor of your life, when you are looking at the pieces of everything you thought you were, and everything you thought you had, it does not feel like you are valuable. It feels like you are ruined. It feels like the damage is too extensive, like too much has been lost. Like even if God wanted to restore you, there wouldn't be enough left to work with. But that is the enemy lying to you in your most vulnerable moment. That is fear speaking louder than faith. Because the truth is that God has never looked at a broken person and decided they were beyond repair. His entire redemptive story, from the very beginning to this present moment, is a story of taking what was broken and making it whole again. That is who He is. Restoration is not just something God does. It is something God is. And if He has allowed the breaking in your life, if He has permitted the pressure and the pain and the process, then it is because He already has the restoration planned. He already sees the finished version of you. He already knows what you are going to look like on the other side of this. And He is not worried, even when you are. He is not panicking, even when you feel like everything is out of control, because the breaking was never the final chapter. It was always just the beginning of the rebuild. There is something that brokenness does that nothing else can do, and I need you to hear this carefully because it might be the most confronting truth in this entire message. Brokenness reveals, it exposes. It pulls back the curtain on everything that was hidden beneath the surface of your life and forces you to look at what was actually there all along. And as uncomfortable as that is, as humbling as that process can be, it is one of the most necessary things that can happen to a person who is serious about walking in the fullness of their purpose. because you cannot fix what you cannot see. You cannot address what you have never been willing to acknowledge. And sometimes God allows the breaking specifically because it is the only way to show you what your life was actually built on. We spend so much of our lives constructing. We are always building something, building an image, building a reputation, building a career, building relationships, building a version of ourselves that we feel comfortable presenting to the world. And there is nothing inherently wrong with building. But the problem comes when we build on foundations that were never designed to hold the weight of what God is trying to construct in our lives. The problem comes when we build on people's approval, on our own understanding, on titles and achievements and external validation, on trauma responses we never dealt with, on survival mechanisms that served us in one season, but were never meant to be permanent structures. And God, in His mercy, in His absolute refusal to let us live beneath what He created us for, will sometimes allow everything built on the wrong foundation to come down. Because here is what I know about construction. A contractor who is serious about building something that will last does not just slap new walls on top of a cracked foundation. He does not put fresh paint over rotting wood and call it renovation. A real builder, a skilled builder, will tear down to the foundation first. He will assess what is actually there. He will determine what can stay and what has to go. And then, and only then, will he begin to build something that is structurally sound, something that can withstand the weight of what is coming, something that is not just aesthetically pleasing on the outside, but genuinely strong from the inside out. God is that kind of builder, and your life is that kind of project. I think about how many of us have been carrying wounds that we never properly healed from, wounds from childhood that we buried under business, wounds from past relationships that we covered with new ones before the old ones ever closed, wounds from betrayal and abandonment and rejection that we learned to function around rather than actually heal from. And we built our lives on top of those unhealed places. We made decisions from those wounds. We chose partners from those wounds. We responded to God from those wounds. And everything looked fine on the surface. Everything looked functional until the pressure came, until the storm hit, until the breaking happened. And suddenly everything we had built started shifting, and we realized that what we thought was solid ground was actually sand. Matthew 7 tells us about two builders, one who built on rock and one who built on sand. And the text is very clear that both houses looked the same before the storm. You couldn't tell the difference from the outside. Both men had worked hard. Both men had put in the effort. But when the rain came, when the floods rose, when the winds beat against those houses, the difference in the foundation became impossible to ignore. The house on sand fell, and the text says great was the fall of it. Not small, not manageable, great. Because the greater the structure built on the wrong foundation, the greater the collapse when that foundation is finally exposed. And I wonder how many of us have experienced that great fall and spent years being ashamed of it, years feeling like the collapse was evidence of our failure, when in reality the collapse was evidence of God's faithfulness. Because a God who loved you less would have let you keep living in a house that looked good, but was structurally unsound. A God who was less committed to your future would have let you stay comfortable on a foundation that could not support where He was trying to take you. But God loves you too much for that. He sees the storms that are coming that you cannot yet see. He knows the weight of the calling on your life, and He understands that a weak foundation will not be able to hold it. And so He allows the exposure. He allows the revealing. Not to humiliate you, but to heal you. Not to destroy you, but to give you a real foundation for the first time. The breaking reveals not just what was wrong with our foundations, but also what was wrong with our self-perception. So many of us had an identity that was constructed entirely from external sources. We knew who we were because of what we did, because of what others said about us, because of the roles we played and the titles we carried. And when those things were stripped away, when the breaking removed the labels and the platforms and the relationships we had used to define ourselves, we found ourselves standing in front of a mirror, unable to recognize the person looking back, because the person we had been presenting was not actually us. It was a construction. It was a carefully managed image built over years of trying to be acceptable, trying to be enough, trying to earn a sense of worth that God had already freely given us. And that is one of the most sacred gifts that brokenness carries. It strips away the false self and creates the space for the true self to finally emerge. It removes the masks that we didn't even realize we were wearing. It dismantles the performance and leaves behind the person, and the person underneath all of that construction. The real person, the one God actually created, is far more beautiful, far more capable, and far more loved than the constructed version ever was. But you will never meet that person as long as the false version is still standing. Sometimes the old has to come down completely before the authentic can have room to breathe. There is freedom on the other side of this kind of exposure. There is a lightness that comes when you are no longer maintaining a structure that was never really you. There is a relief that comes when you stop trying to hold together something that God was never asking you to hold. And when you finally surrender to the revealing, when you stop being afraid of what the breaking is showing you and start being curious about it, when you stop running from the exposure and start sitting in it long enough to let God show you what He sees, that is when the real rebuilding can begin. That is when God can finally build something in your life that is not just impressive to look at, but genuinely able to hold everything He has planned for you. I want to take you somewhere that most people don't want to go, because most people have spent so much energy trying to get out of their lowest point that they never stopped long enough to recognize what was actually happening there. And I understand that. I understand the instinct to climb, to escape, to do whatever it takes to get back to a place that feels manageable, a place that feels like you have some control, a place where the pain is not quite so loud and the questions are not quite so overwhelming. But I need you to consider something today that might completely change the way you see the valley you are standing in or the valley you have already walked through. Your lowest point is not just a place you survive. It is a place that, if you let it, will become the very hinge on which the entire direction of your life turns. We have been conditioned to see low points as interruptions, as detours, as evidence that something in our story went wrong. And because we see them that way, we spend all of our energy in those seasons just trying to get back to where we were. We want to return to the before. We want to recover the version of our life that existed prior to the loss, prior to the failure, prior to the breakdown, prior to whatever it was that brought us to our knees. But what if going back was never the point? What if the lowest point was not designed to return you to where you were, but to launch you into something you have never been before? What if everything you lost in the falling was actually making room for everything God was trying to give you in the rising? I think about the prodigal son, and I want you to really sit in that story for a moment, because there is something in it that we tend to rush past. The text tells us that when the son had spent everything, when he had hit the absolute bottom, when he was feeding pigs and longing to eat what the pigs were eating, it was in that moment, in that lowest of low places, that the text says he came to himself, not before the bottom, not somewhere on the way down, at the bottom. And I find that detail to be one of the most honest and one of the most hope-filled things in all of Scripture, because it tells us that sometimes the bottom is the only place where we can finally hear ourselves clearly. Sometimes the bottom is the only place where all the noise and all the distraction and all the false versions of ourselves finally go quiet enough for us to hear the still small voice that has been trying to reach us all along. The prodigal son came to himself at his lowest point, and when he came to himself, he made a decision. He got up. He turned around, he went back to his father, and the father, who the text tells us saw him while he was still a great way off, ran to meet him. Not walked, ran, which tells me that the father had been watching, had been waiting, had been looking down that road every single day, hoping to see his child coming home. And the moment the son turned around, the moment he made the decision to move in a different direction, the father didn't wait for him to arrive. He covered the distance himself. And that is the God we serve, a God who, when you hit your lowest point and finally turn toward him, does not stand at a distance and wait for you to clean yourself up before he receives you. He runs. He covers the distance. He meets you right where you are, in the middle of the mess, in the middle of the shame, in the middle of the consequences of every bad decision, and he wraps his arms around you and calls you his. But I want you to notice that the turning point only happened at the bottom. It was the lowest point that created the conditions for the son's return. It was the rock bottom that finally broke through the pride and the independence and the self-sufficiency that had driven him away from his father in the first place. And sometimes that is exactly what our lowest point is doing in our lives. It is not punishing us. It is breaking through. It is getting past every defense mechanism, every wall we have built, every layer of self-reliance that has been keeping us from the kind of surrender that actually opens the door to transformation. There are things that God can only do in you at the bottom. There are conversations he can only have with you when everything else has been stripped away. There are revelations about who he is and who you are that only become accessible when you have exhausted every other option and every other source, and you are finally completely, utterly dependent on him alone. And I know that doesn't make the bottom feel any less painful. I know that doesn't make the low season any less dark, but it does give it meaning. It does give it purpose. It does transform it from a place of pure suffering into a place of sacred encounter. And a place of sacred encounter, no matter how painful it feels while you are in it, is never a place you leave the same way you arrived. I have talked to enough people, and I have lived enough life to know that the most profound shifts, the most significant turning points, the most real and lasting transformations almost always have a low point somewhere in the story. Not because God requires suffering, not because pain is the price of progress, but because low points have a unique capacity to crack us open in ways that nothing else can. They have a way of making us honest when comfort would have let us keep lying to ourselves. They have a way of making us hungry for something real when everything superficial has failed us. They have a way of redirecting our attention from the things that were consuming us to the things that actually matter. And when you look back, not from the middle of it, but from the other side of it, you will see that your lowest point was loaded with purpose. You will see the hand of God in places where you only felt his absence. You will see that he was working even when he was silent, that he was present even when he felt distant, that he was building even when everything around you was falling apart. You will see that the low point was not a detour from your destiny. It was the road that led you directly to it. It was the place where the old version of you finally had to die so the true version of you could finally live. It was the location where your story stopped being about surviving and started being about becoming. I need you to stay with me all the way through this, because what I am about to say is going to require something from you. It is going to require you to stretch your faith past what you can currently see. It is going to require you to believe something about your future that your present circumstances have not yet given you any visible evidence for. And I know that is hard. I know that when you are standing in the middle of a season of loss and pain and rebuilding, the last thing that feels natural is expectation. The last thing that feels accessible is hope, because hope requires you to look forward when everything in you is still processing what is behind you. But I am telling you today, with everything in me, that what God is building after the breaking is not just a repaired version of what was. It is something altogether greater, altogether deeper, altogether more aligned with the fullness of what he created you for than anything you had before the breaking ever was. We have a tendency as human beings to measure our future by our past. We look at what we had, we look at what we lost, and we calculate what recovery looks like based on those numbers. We think restoration means getting back to where we were. We think rebuilding means reconstructing what was torn down. But God's mathematics are not our mathematics. His idea of restoration is not returning you to your previous condition. His idea of restoration is elevation. His idea of rebuilding is not replication. It is transformation. And the reason what comes after the breaking is always greater is because the breaking itself changed you in ways that make you capable of carrying something you could never have handled before. Think about Job. Think about a man who lost everything. His children, his wealth, his health, his comfort, the support of his own wife, the understanding of his closest friends. Think about a man who sat in the ash heap of his own life and wrestled with God in one of the most raw and honest dialogues recorded in all of Scripture. And think about what the end of Job's story looks like. The text tells us that God restored Job's losses and gave him twice as much as he had before. Not the same, not equal. Twice as much. And I want you to understand why it had to be more and not just the same. Because Job was not the same person on the other side of his suffering. The man who emerged from that ash heap was deeper, was more refined, was more acquainted with the true nature of God than the man who had entered the suffering. And a deeper person can carry a greater weight. A more refined person can steward a greater blessing. A person who has genuinely encountered God in the fire comes out of that fire with a capacity that simply did not exist before they went in. That is what the breaking does when you surrender to the process. It enlarges you. It stretches your capacity for faith, for empathy, for resilience, for wisdom, for depth of character. It produces in you things that cannot be produced any other way. The Apostle Paul understood this. He wrote from prison, from shipwrecks, from beatings, from every kind of suffering imaginable, that the things he went through were producing in him an eternal weight of glory that far outweighed them all, not equal to them, not comparable to them, far beyond them. And Paul could see that not because he was superhuman, but because he had learned to look at his suffering through the lens of what God was producing through it, rather than what it was costing him in the moment. I want to talk to someone who is in the middle of the rebuilding right now. Someone who has already been through the breaking and is now in that in-between place, that awkward, uncomfortable, uncertain place where the old thing is gone, but the new thing is not yet fully visible. And I know that place is hard in its own unique way, because at least in the breaking you knew what was happening. At least in the crisis there was a clarity to the pain. But in the rebuilding, in the in-between, things are uncertain. Things are unformed. You can feel that something is coming, but you cannot yet see its full shape. And that uncertainty can be its own kind of torment if you don't know how to hold it. But I need you to understand that the in-between is not empty. The in-between is not wasted time. The in-between is actually some of the most important work of the entire process, because it is in the in-between that God is laying foundations, establishing things in you that are invisible to the naked eye, but absolutely critical to the structure that is coming. It is in the in-between that your character is being aligned with your calling. It is in the in-between that your roots are going deeper, so that when the new thing finally blooms, it will not be blown over by the first wind that comes against it. You cannot rush this part. You cannot microwave a sequoia tree. Some things require time, not because God is slow, but because what he is building requires depth that only time can produce. And I want you to think about the concept of refinement. When metal is refined, when gold is put through fire, it does not come out of that fire as the same gold that went in. It comes out purer. It comes out with the impurities burned away. It comes out more valuable, more luminous, more useful than it was before the fire ever touched it. And the fire did not destroy its identity as gold. The fire revealed its true identity as gold. The fire removed everything that was not gold, so that what remained was the purest, most authentic expression of what it always was. And that is what God is doing in you through the breaking and the rebuilding. He is not changing what He made you to be. He is removing everything that was covering it, everything that was diluting it, everything that was competing with it, so that what remains is the clearest, most undiluted, most powerful expression of the person He created you to be from the very beginning. What comes after the breaking is greater, not just in terms of what you have, in terms of who you are. It is greater in terms of the peace you carry, because you have now walked through the storm and discovered that God was in it. It is greater in terms of the authority you walk in, because authority that has been tested is a completely different thing from authority that has only ever existed in theory. It is greater in terms of the impact you carry into every room you walk into, because people can feel the difference between someone who has read about God's faithfulness and someone who has lived it. Someone who has been broken and rebuilt carries something in their spirit that cannot be manufactured, cannot be faked, cannot be acquired any other way except through the process. And that something is what makes them dangerous to the kingdom of darkness and invaluable to the kingdom of light. So I need to bring this full circle, because I don't want you to leave here today with just information. I want you to leave here with a revelation that changes the way you see everything you have been through and everything that is still ahead of you. We started this journey talking about brokenness. We talked about how it is not punishment, but preparation. We talked about how God never breaks what He does not intend to restore. We talked about how the breaking reveals what was never built on the right foundation. We talked about how your lowest point is often your turning point. And we talked about how what comes after the breaking is always greater than what was before it. And I want you to see that these are not 5 separate ideas. They are 5 chapters of one story. They are 5 movements in one symphony. They are 5 parts of a single, intentional, purposeful process that God uses to take a person from where they are to where He always destined them to be. And that person is you. That story is yours. I know some of you came in here today still carrying the weight of a breaking that you have not yet made peace with. Still asking why. Still looking at the pieces of something you loved, something you built, something you were, and wondering if any of it is ever going to make sense. And I want to speak directly to you right now, not as a preacher behind a pulpit, but as someone who has sat in the ash heap, as someone who has held the pieces of a life that fell apart and wondered if God had forgotten His own promises. He has not forgotten. He has not miscalculated. He has not looked away. Every single thing that has touched your life has been filtered through the hands of a God who loved you before you were formed, who called you by name before you took your first breath, who saw the end of your story before the first chapter was ever written. And in that story, the breaking was never the ending. It was always the beginning of something greater. I want you to stop apologizing for your process. I want you to stop being ashamed of your seasons of falling apart. I want you to stop hiding the evidence of what you have been through as though it disqualifies you, because the truth is that it is the very thing that equips you. Your scars are not blemishes. They are credentials. They are proof that you went through something that should have finished you, and you are still here. They are evidence of a grace that held you together, even when you were convinced you were completely falling apart. And if you are in the breaking right now, if this is your lowest point, if you are sitting in the middle of a season that you cannot yet see the purpose in, I need you to hear this with everything you have. This is not the end of your story. This is not where God leaves you. This is the part of the story that makes every chapter that comes after it make sense. This is the part that future you will look back on and say, That was where everything changed. That was where God got his hands on me in a way that nothing else could have made possible. That was where I stopped being who I was trying to be and started becoming who I was always meant to be. The breaking is not the final word. The rebuilding is coming. And what God builds next is going to be greater than anything you have lost, greater than anything you have mourned, greater than anything you could have constructed on your own with your own hands and your own plans and your own understanding. Because this time it will be built on the right foundation. This time it will be built by hands that do not make mistakes. This time it will be built to last, built to hold, built to carry the full weight of the purpose and the calling and the destiny that God has had in mind for you from the very beginning. You are not too broken to be rebuilt. You are not too far gone to be restored. You are not too damaged to be used. You are exactly where God can do his greatest work. And the same God who brought you through everything that tried to destroy you is the same God who is standing over your life right now with a blueprint in his hand and a vision in his heart, ready to build something in you and through you and with you that is going to leave the world forever changed by the fact that you did not give up in the breaking.